You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Mike Lupica.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find archives of all of the shows at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, look over in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. It's free to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, now Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. That's hankgarner.com. I'd like to tell you about a few folks before we get into today's interview. Ernie Howard has a new book up for pre-order. It's called Melody 8. My mother used to sing to me when I was scared at night. She would lay beside me and I would place my head on her chest, hearing the song through the vibration of her body. I loved my mother's voice right up to the day she was put to death because of it. If you're a lover of post-apocalyptic stories, you need to get ready for a new twist on the genre. We must change the vibration or the frequency will forever change us. Melody 8. Pre-order it now from Ernie Howard. Soulbreaker by Clara Colson is free right now. There's a dangerous monster loose on the streets of Aurora, Michigan, and Detective Cal Kinsey is determined to stop it, or die trying. 2 years ago, Cal Kinsey was an up-and-coming cop in the Aurora Police Department, but during a fateful nighttime stakeout in search of a prolific killer, Cal witnessed the darkest corner of his dreams come to life. A rogue vampire slaughtered his partner and introduced Cal to the supernatural world he never knew existed in the shadows. Soulbreaker is free now from Clara Colson. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also by August Ansel, After the Pretty Pox, The Attic. A searing act of bioterrorism, a catastrophic plague they call the Pretty Pox. Most of the human race is dead, and for 2 years, Ari McInnes has been alone, riding out the aftermath of the disease. Hidden in the attic of her ruined home, Ari survives by wit and skill, ritual and habit. Convinced that humans are little more than a dangerous fluke of nature, she chooses solitude, even in matters of life and death. Ari's precarious world is upended when her youngest brother, a man she's never met, appears out of nowhere with a badly injured woman. Their presence in the attic draws the attention of a dark watcher in the woods, and Ari is soon forced to choose between the narrow ideas that have sustained her and a stubborn instinct to love and protect. In Book 1 of August Ansel's captivating post-apocalyptic series, After the Pretty Pox cast an unwavering eye on what it means to be human in a world where nature has the upper hand, and the only rules left to live by, for good or ill, are the ones written on our hearts. After the Pretty Pox, The Attic. There's a link to it in the show notes. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Mike Lupica on the show with me today. His brand new book, Robert B. Parker's Blood-Feud, is out now. It's the seventh book in the Sunny Randall series. If you guys are Robert B. Parker fans like I am, you are going to absolutely love this book. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been one of the happiest experiences of my whole life, and this book is blessedly getting the best reviews I've ever gotten in a nearly 40-year career of writing books.
Oh, how exciting. We're going to get all into that in just a second, Mike, but we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh my goodness! If you ask my 90-something parents right now, they will tell you that when I was 9 and 10 years old, I was writing mystery stories and adventure stories longhand, with myself as the main character. When I've gone around the country talking to my young readers over the last 15 years, I always say, listen, you have to buy these books because I have no other skills. If the writing thing falls apart, I have nothing to fall back on. And I always tell the kids, and don't count television, because if I can get a show, anybody can.
I love it. So this has been a lifelong passion for you.
Oh, I started writing for the school paper in high school. I started writing for 3 school papers, working nights at the Boston Globe, writing for Boston Phoenix and Boston Magazine and the Globe when I was in college. And I had 2 plans. I had 2 plans from the start. I wanted to get to New York and write a column, and I wanted to write novels because my 2 newspaper heroes, Pete Hamill and Jimmy Breslin, had written columns and wrote novels, and that was my plan. And, I got to live out my dreams. And to get to live out my dreams with this book has been particularly gratifying.
Oh, absolutely. The new book, Blood-Feud, is a typical Robert B. Parker style book. It's a PI mystery, with some thriller elements. Sunny Randall, this fabulous character that Robert created. Looking back at your body of work, before we started recording, you began as a sports writer. You became the youngest columnist in New York. And you had this fantastic career writing sports and sport-related stories. What was the initial draw to want to write those kinds of columns?
It's all I had ever done. It's all I ever dreamed about doing. When I was at Boston College, I was up at Boston College, my alma mater. My 3 sons went there. I have a daughter there now. It's like a family business. I was just up there on a 3-day writing residency. And I told all the kids that I talked to, always do your best work because you don't know who's going to see it.
Yeah.
Somehow, one of my first columns for The Heights, our school paper, which is still the school paper at BC, ended up on the desk of the sports editor of the Boston Globe at that time.
Wow. And
he called me up and said, would you like to write a piece for the Globe? And in my interior dialogue at that point, Hank, was this. Yes, I think I can find time in my busy schedule to write a piece for the Boston Globe. I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe about a baton twirler, as a matter of fact. And they put it on the front page. And from that moment on, I knew that I was even more convinced what my career path ought to be. And again, to this day, I don't know how that column ended up on the late Ernie Roberts' desk, but it did. And that moment, it changed my life. It changed the course of my life because I was more convinced than ever that I was in the right world.
What's really interesting, Mike, is we've published more than 525 author interviews on the show. We've talked to a lot of people, and you hear lots and lots of stories. And you cannot discount the benefits of hard work and showing up to do the work every single day and honing your craft and all of that stuff. That's vitally important and cannot be overlooked. But there's also this crazy element of luck that comes about sometimes, and opportunities that pop up that you just cannot account for. But you have to be prepared when those come along. I believe people get opportunities all the time. We're not aware enough to know when to grab hold of those.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the message that I give to young writers and young readers all the time. Make sure that every single piece of work it doesn't have to be the best you'll ever do, but make that piece the best one, because you don't know. I'll tell you another story about my career and when I ended up in New York. I was freelancing the year I got out of Boston College, and I was writing for the Globe and the Boston Phoenix, which was kind of the Village Voice of Boston, and I was writing for tennis magazines. I was getting after it. And one day I got a call from the sports editor of the New York Post. This is in 1975. I was a year out of BC, and his name was Ike Gellis, and he said, "Would you like? I'd like to talk to you about a job." And I said, "Okay." And somebody had sent some of my Boston Phoenix pieces to him, and I took the job. I moved to New York during the World Series in 1975, And the first week I was there, I wrote 4 features in the sports section. One was about the Jets. One was about Army football. I forget what the other 2 were about. I go in at the end of the week, and I look at my schedule for my second week in New York. Second week in New York. I'm 23 years old. And the Knicks were opening their season, and it was Knicks, game story, Knicks. And so Mr. Gellis had already informed me he didn't need to see me around the office. Just go out and write. So, but he was on the phone, I think, with his bookie. And I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Gellis, he goes, "What?" And I said, "Well, I just looked at my next week's schedule, and I couldn't help but notice that you've got me covering the Knicks, and which was the biggest beat on the Post." He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I thought Lenny Lewin, who was a legendary New York basketball writer, covered the Knicks." And Ike Gellis looked at me and he said, "Not anymore." And Lenny had wanted to get off the beat. And it was not until that moment that, to say that I had been hired out of obscurity would be like insulting to actually obscure people. I was way more obscure than that. He had hired me off of what he had seen in the Boston Phoenix and my first week on the job to cover the New York Knicks. So once again, my life changed in that moment. And a year later, I was writing a column for the New York Daily News.
What an insane story. That is exciting and terrifying all at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's like getting hit by lightning.
Right.
But it was that's how it happened. And everything good that happened to me in my career began with a phone call from the sports editor of the Boston Globe and a phone call from the sports editor of the old New York Post.
How amazing. You said from an early age that you loved mysteries, and those self-starring mysteries were the first things that you wrote. And you said you had these dual goals and loves, that you wanted to write a column and you also wanted to write novels. What was the thing that opened the novel writing door for you?
Well, I was in New York. I was writing a column, and my fictional heroes had always been mystery writers. John D. McDonald with the Travis McGee series, Elmore Leonard, who became a dear friend of mine over the last 30 years of his life. But my favorite was Robert B. Parker. And I had picked up the Godwolf manuscript, his first Spencer, off a shelf at a Brentano's, now gone, on Boylston Street when I was at BC. And it began a love affair with these books that, continued not only through his death, but the resumption of all these series. And I wanted to write books like that. And finally, I screwed up my courage and began a 3-book series of novels about a New York investigative reporter for a cable news channel named Peter Finley. And the first one got nominated for an Edgar Award. I ended up writing it as a CBS movie that was on, I forget what year, sometime in the early 90s. And, I go back and read them now, and I can see how much I was influenced, particularly by Mr. Parker and his voice. By the time I was writing those books, we had begun a friendship that would last until he died. And mostly built around baseball, but we'd run into each other. We did some radio shows together. I visited his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the famous house where he lived on one floor. His wife, Joan, lived on another. They had a common area in between, and were madly in love. And that relationship is pretty much the relationship between Spencer and Susan Silverman in the books. So even when I went off on another lane and began writing these sports novels for young readers with Travel Team in 2004, and that's like 5 or 6 million books ago. I've had like 15 New York Times bestsellers with those books. In the back of my mind, I was always going to go back to mysteries, and then again, I got hit by lightning again last summer. My agent, Esther Newberg, to my mind, the greatest literary agent in the business, we've been together for nearly 40 years. She represents Daniel and David Parker. the Parker sons, because Joan Parker died not too terribly long after Bob did. And so I'm up at a rented house in Vermont last summer, and my daughter and my wife are with me. And I was just sitting around one day, and I called Esther, and I said, I always meant to ask you, the Spencer novels got resumed, the Jesse Stone novels got resumed, but the Westerns got resumed. How come nobody continued Sunny Randall? She said, you know what, I'll find out. She calls Ivan Held over at Putnam, calls me back an hour later and said, Ivan wants to know if you'll write a sample chapter. I said, no. I wasn't looking for, I have enough to do.
I wasn't looking for a job.
I wasn't, I didn't think of our call as a job interview. She said, shut up and write the chapter.
Yes, ma'am.
No. It's our relationship is work. It's why she's the best. And I got up early the next morning, sitting at a dining room table in this rental house in Vermont, and wrote the chapter by early afternoon. And that chapter is pretty much the opening chapter of Blood-Feud, with a few minor changes in it. And she sent it over to them. They called up the next morning. I had a deal to write what became Blood-Feud. And it started with that random phone call. And then from the moment I wrote the first exchange between Sunny and her pal Spike, it was like a gay superhero in these books, and one of the greatest characters Robert B. ever came up with. And they're sitting at his restaurant, and she says to him, do I look as if I'm getting older? Spike says, this is a trap. And she said, no, I'm serious. The UPS kid mammed me the other day. And Spike said, I assume you shot him. And literally from that moment, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged with old friends, even though the last Sunny, which I had just recently read by sheer chance, had been 10 years ago. And so off we went, and it came out on November 27th. It literally has gotten the best reviews. I have every major place. It's gotten the best reviews I've ever gotten in my life. And the sense I get as I've traveled the country is, you know what? They're as happy to have Sunny back as I was writing Sunny.
Well, I have a copy of the book. I've had it for a couple of weeks now, I think. And when I got it, I flipped it, over and read the dust jacket and all of that stuff. And I sat, in my chair in my office, meaning to get up and go do something else. And about an hour and a half later, I was way deep, in Blood-Feud. And what struck me, what did not strike me in the beginning, nothing struck me in the beginning. It felt like I'd just fallen into another Robert B. Parker, book, because I've read tons of them, over the years. I know that unique voice, that Mr. Parker had, and you just nailed it. I mean, I was, like you said, in the feeling you had in writing it was the feeling I had in reading it. Like I was right back there. Do you, attribute, that being able to, I don't want to say replicate his voice, because that's not it. It's like you just tuned into the same channel he was on. What do you attribute that to?
It's what you just said is a great description of what I felt. I wasn't trying to imitate him, but right. That sound had been in my head. It's attitude. And you know this as a Parker fan. Yes, I wanted to replicate that attitude, because that attitude wasn't just his that had influenced me in ways that I probably will never completely understand, but that's the attitude of my sports column. That's the attitude that I wrote when I was writing one-liners for my Sunday column that I used to write for the Daily News called Shooting from the Lip, where I'd write a little essay at the top, and then it would be a series of one-liners. And that voice seems such a perfect, it felt like a baseball fitting into the pocket of a glove. And right. Once I started writing, I felt like I was surrounded by old friends, that Dr. Susan Silverman, who was Spencer's girlfriend, but who he had brought into the Sunny books, Vinnie Morris, a legendary shooter. And the funny thing is, when I want to use Spencer characters, my first call is to Ace, because I consider Ace now the Godfather because he's doing Ace Atkins doing such a wonderful job with the Spencer novels. And I said,
Right.
Can I have Tony, Marcus, and Vinny? And he said, yes. And I said, but remember, Vinny's living has an office now above a bowling alley up off of Route 2, and right away we're talking about them like they're real people. But
Right.
guess what?
They are.
They are.
That's right. That's right. I love that you said that this was the same attitude. I think attitude is the right word that I was grasping for a minute ago, because that's it. And attitude goes bigger than voice. It goes bigger than getting settings right. The attitude is what spills out off the page. Conventional wisdom would say that if you are a writer and you have found your audience, that you should stay there and you should not venture off and do other things that might confuse your readers. And there's probably lots of good advice in that, but you have written sports columns, you've written biographies, with people, you've written this young, reader series, and, revolving around sports and mystery. Is there ever any, do you ever worry about, doing something that people won't like and coming out from what you normally do?
No, I've always embraced new stuff because you can't keep doing the same stuff over and over again. I mean, Bob Parker had Spencer, but then he came up with a woman as a private eye. And then he came up with a small town cop with a drinking problem. And then he came up with Coop and Hitch in the Westerns. And yeah, I mean, I got a chance to write my first mystery because it was part of a deal. They really wanted me to write Reggie Jackson's autobiography, which I did. I have written nonfiction. I have written books for young readers. I wrote a series of comic novels in the early century about pro sports, Bump and Run and Red Zone, about a bad boy who inherits a football team that were extremely well received. I just started a series of picture book mysteries for 6 to 9 year olds as a way of starting to grow my younger readers. So yeah, I knew what a tough job I was taking on with Sunny and the high standards that Parker readers have, because you know what? I am a Parker reader. I am
Right.
a lover of these books. And so, but if I didn't think I could do it, I would have done it. And literally from the moment that Ivan Held and my brilliant editor, Sarah Minich, read these first 10 pages, I think it was just 10 pages that I sent them, they could tell that I knew who he was, who these characters were, and they said, let's go for it.
Nice. In your time that you spent with Mr. Parker before he passed, and the friendship that you struck up, did you guys ever talk storycraft?
No, never. You know, we mostly talked. I would say 95% of the time we talked about baseball. He was a crazed Red Sox fan. I switched laptops or computers a couple of years ago after he died. And I realized I had lost a lot of the summer emails that we would send about the baseball season. But one time we ran into each other on a book tour in Washington, D.C. I forget what book I was publicizing. I forget what book he was publishing. But we ended up at the Four Seasons in Georgetown. And he said, Mikey, he called me Mikey. Mikey, let's have dinner. I said, great. He said, why don't you make a reservation back here? I said, okay. I said, my signing's at 6:30. What time's yours, Bob? And he said, 7 to 8. And it was probably a politics and prose. In my memory, it was politics and prose. And I said, well, what time should we make the reservation for? And he said, 8:15. I said, well, Bob, wait a minute. You know, there are probably going to be a lot of people to see you tonight. How do you know you'll be done in time to get back here? And he looked at me and he said, Mikey, let me explain something to you. When I look up and the clock says 8 o'clock tonight, even if I'm between Robert B. and Parker. I'm out of there. And and he was another time he was talking to me, and he said, so-and-so asked me to blurb this book, and I did. I said, oh, that's nice of you, Bob. And he said, and then the guy calls me up, and he said, well, did you really like it that much? And Parker said, I had to explain to him. I said, kid, I'll read them or I'll blurb them, but I won't do both.
That's amazing.
That's amazing. He was such fun to know, but as passionate as he was about his work, he was as passionate about the Boston Red Sox, about whom our mutual friend Mike Barnacle once said, in Boston, the Red Sox are not a matter of life and death. They're way more serious than that.
Oh, my goodness. That's amazing. So tell us a little about the new book, Blood-Feud. I know we're running short on time.
Sure.
What can we expect from Sunny? If someone, used to be a Sunny Randall fan, but, have not picked up a book in a while, where can they expect, us to pick up and what can they expect from Sunny?
Well, okay. I'll tell you. First of all, she's back with Richie. Richie gets shot almost right away. He is purposely not killed. The shooter knows exactly where to hit him. The shooter stands over him and says, sins of the father. And it starts off, Richie is, for people who have not read the book, Richie Burke is Sunny's ex-husband. He is the child of a Boston crime family, but he's legit. He has never been part of the family business. He owns a saloon. They have been married and divorced. Richie got married and divorced again. They have now started back up. They love each other. They can't live together, and it's mostly because of Sunny. And it's complicated her life and their life together. The feud is a feud out of the past between two old gangsters. I don't want to talk too much about it, but there's a surprise in this book that I swear to you I did not know was coming until I wrote it. When something like that happens, you really do think you have the best job in the world. And hey, here's the most flattering review I got, and again, if you go through them, you'll see them. Book List, Book Reporter, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, all of them, okay? And I forget which one, the reviewer said, if this were a series that wasn't about Sunny Randall, if you were reading the first book of about a private detective from Boston named Samantha Jones, you would still love this book. And that's what I was shooting for. You can go back and read the other Sunnies, but you can read this as a standalone because I let them know, enough backstory to bring you up to speed.
Love it. I love it. Mike, you are one of those artists who really has something to offer nearly every reader. You write hard-boiled mysteries like we're talking about, great sports-themed books, biographies, and the series for younger readers that you mentioned. If people are just learning about you and your work, is there a place where they can go and find all of the stuff that you do and maybe dig into your back catalog and follow news of what's coming up next?
Yeah, you can go to MikeLupicabooks.com, but or just if you go to Amazon, you'll see Travel Team was my first book for young readers. It was in 10 days with very little fanfare. It was number one on the New York Times bestseller list. The new series is called Zack and Zoey, and I'll just tell you the fun of doing that was it's about two 8-year-olds who solve mysteries in the third grade. And they are Zack and Zoey Walker, and I've made them the children of Danny Walker, who was the star of Travel Team. So I kind of brought everything full circle. And for people who love Sunny, and people are loving Sunny Randall, just know that right before I talk to you today, I finished Chapter 5. I write on these yellow legal pads. I finished Chapter 5 of Sunny 2, and I'm happy to be back in her world.
Yes, that is fantastic news. Mike, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. We're going to put links to all of your great stuff in the show notes. Thank you for what you're doing with Sunny, and we look forward to much more coming.
Thank you for your interest in my books. This is a really fun conversation to have. Thank you so much.
Author Mary Buckham has a 3-book set. She's a USA Today bestseller. The Invisible Recruits, The Beginning, a 3-book set. Kindle edition is on sale now for $2.99. That's 3 books for $2.99. Join new IR agents Alec Nozick and Kelly McAllister as they struggle to master their newfound preternatural abilities while being thrown into a dark world of danger and intrigue. Being an invisible recruit means learn hard lessons fast or die trying. Hidden from a world unaware of magic, Alex and Kelly are members of a group of operatives known as the Invisible Recruits, the only ones willing to stand between mankind and those powerful preternatural factions, seeking to change the balance of power and gain world domination. While battling for their lives, Alex and Kelly both must deal with dangerous creatures, mysterious pasts, shape-shifting brothers, and more. What could possibly go wrong? Begin with the novella that started it all, Invisible Prison, to discover how Alex Nozick first met the IR team. Then join Alex on her initial solo mission in Invisible Magic. Next, it's time to join teammate Kelly McAllister in a race to uncover secrets and stop evil growing in the heart of Africa. Mary writes stories full of grit and determination with plenty of action, but always with a sense of hope and a good dollop of romance. Get the 3-book set for only $2.99. Invisible Recruits, The Beginning, a 3-book set for Kindle. Also, I'd like to thank George Kramer. His new book, To Some It's Just a Rose, is out now. Nancy Hemingway is a beautiful, wealthy heiress that has a penchant for attracting weirdos. When roses start mysteriously appearing at her doorstep, at work, and everywhere, she turns. Her friends begin disappearing. Nancy enlists her eccentric cousin Etna to help her figure out what's going on, only to discover that Etna isn't who she thought she was. Nothing is as it appears to be, and someone is targeting Nancy. Can she outsmart this lunatic and find her friends before it's too late? The new psychological thriller from George Kramer, To Some It's Just a Rose. Thank you to J.R. Hanley and Chris Winder. Their new book, Breach Team, is out now. Survival means fighting through the unknown. Corporal John Harden is a decorated soldier living in the shadow of his father, a celebrated war hero. Determined to make his own way in the galaxy, John develops a reputation as a brawler, serving aboard the USS Hughes. A rescue beacon brings John and his fellow legionnaires to a cargo ship thought lost 2 decades ago, and the heavily damaged alien vessel of an unknown species that took it down. With the brass demanding details and apparent survivors begging for aid, John's team boards the derelict ships, vowing to leave no man behind. On board, nightmares become reality as John and his team are separated and left behind, presumed to be killed in action. Assaulted on all sides by mysterious alien tech, John gets the chance to finally prove himself worth being his father's son, if he can survive the onslaught. The way home is inside, and John won't back down from the fight, though a determined enemy will make him pay for every inch. Breach Team is a non-stop action thrill ride with fast-paced warfare written by 2 veterans. Join the fight by getting your copy today. Breach Team by J.R. Hanley and Chris Winder. Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. You can find archives of all of the shows at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please subscribe. Up next is an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Midnight struck. The Sandman had come. A few faint notes drifted through the rooms of 417 Gorybrook. The hollow wind testing the weatherproofing, the weak scritch of the persimmon tree against Zeph's window, and the drone of Hedwig's snoring. The old house shifted, creaked, and the shade of Agatha Van Brunt descended from the attic. "Brom?" she called. The ghost paused, collecting herself on the stair. She passed a mirror, but the glass remained empty, reflecting only absence. Agatha would not have recognized herself anyway. She had been beautiful long ago, and still was in her own mind. Not a toothless and wizened spectre. Not a blue chalk sketch of a hag half erased from the blackboard of night. She drifted into the master bedroom, disappeared into a shaft of moonbeams, and reappeared on the other side. She stood over Hedwig, listening to him snore. But Hedwig was not Brom. She needed Brom. She slipped through the floor into Zeph's bedroom. She stood over him for a long time, listening to the persimmon tree's weak coffin scratch on the window screen. "Brom?" No, this was not Brom her son. But she loved this boy. So much hidden potential. He reminded her of Dylan, her grandson. Dylan had slept in this room many, many times. But Dylan was dead, never to return. This boy, Zeph, was alive. So alive.
Oh, would that he might remain so forever. Look at him. Who would consign such a handsome lad to the rot of death? Only a very cruel and blind God.
Agatha brushed her spectral lips to Zeph's cheek. He stirred, scratched the spot, and rolled into his pillow. But Zeph was not Brom. Where?
Oh, Brom is dead.
She remembered now.
Brom is dead, and so are Hermanus, my husband, and Hans, my brother, and old Baltus Van Tassel, and Katrina, all dead. Only old Agatha remains, after a fashion, to trouble the world.
Her sense of herself sharpened and returned to her. She searched the rooms for the Crane boy. She sensed him. Yes, here was the boy, sleeping fitfully, holding his animal. She extended a hand as if to reach into Jason's chest and take his heart in her talons. The dog woke, sensing Agatha's presence, and growled.
Growl till your voice cracks, cur. I could kill this child myself. I could possess the man or the boy. I could take the butcher knife from the drawer. I could stride through the night in strong male form and dissect this child at my whim.
Something struck her. Something blasted her up and away from the boy. She collected her energies again and tried to re-enter, but could not pass through the walls. When she found her voice, it came as hollow and cold as wind through a tomb.
Who is here?
Agatha whispered, and her tone might have withered grass.
Show yourself.
She waited with growing confusion and anxiety. She threw herself forward and battered the door like a tempest.
Who is here?
She cried. But no one answered.